This actually arose from a completely different quarter, and I don't know if you have the pleasure of having children. I don't, but I still get children ask me questions that makes you think a lot. And the question that I was asked was, is it possible that there is life anywhere else in the, well, not just the galaxy, but in the cosmos? Now, of course, the answer is very simple. We don't know. But it did cause me to consider the Earth in more detail and look at the features of the Earth which are essential to life. And that's basically what I'd like to present to you this evening. And to start with, I'd like to read a couple of scriptures from the Psalms. Psalm is in the Old Testament, isn't it? That's a wee joke, sorry. And it's chapter 8, verse 3. And it says, "When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you are mindful of him?" Just repeat that. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you think of him? And chapter 19, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork." Now, in speaking about it, I'd like to speak about features actually that occur on the Earth which are essential to life. And then to speak about the moon, and you might be surprised that the moon has got any bearing on whether or not you can have life on this planet, but it does, and you'll see why. Also, exactly how the Earth orbits around the sun has a profound impact on whether or not life can exist on this planet. And you might be surprised to hear that the other planets in the solar system also play a very key role in having life on this planet. It's of no surprise, of course, that the sun itself is one of the key elements in this. But another aspect which might be surprising is the fact of the galaxy. Exactly where we are in the galaxy determines whether or not life is possible on this planet. So I intend to deal with it in that order. So starting off with, first of all, with the Earth. Now, you're very familiar, of course, that the surface of the Earth is covered by the atmosphere, and it's principally nitrogen gas. And I like this particular picture because it shows very, very nicely the atmosphere occurring along the bottom here. This is this very sort of haze, thin haze. It just shows you how thin the atmosphere is relative to the rest of the planet. Now, of course, the two elements which we're particularly interested in concerning life is oxygen and carbon dioxide. And we're familiar with the fact that we breathe in oxygen and we breathe out carbon dioxide, and that plants do the reverse, that they breathe in carbon dioxide and they breathe in oxygen. That's in the presence of sunlight. And there's a nice balance between the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom, where the oxygen and the carbon dioxide remain at a relatively stable level, because there's a nice balance of interchange between the plants and the animals. Now, of course, we're very aware of the whole business of global warming and the concept that the levels of carbon dioxide is increasing in the atmosphere, mainly due to the activities of man. But I don't actually intend to go down that line at all. I want to try and stick to the subject at hand. Now, this is the planet Venus, and I show you this because Venus was called the sister planet of the Earth because it was of a similar size to our planet, and it appeared to be of similar composition. So it was reckoned that within our solar system, if there was going to be any other planet which would have life such as we know it, Venus was the most ideal candidate. The problem with Venus was that it was covered by such a dense atmosphere that we really had no idea what was happening on the surface. And we've only fairly recently discovered that the surface is so hot that metal exists in its molten state. Now, it doesn't require an Einstein to work out that life cannot exist in such circumstances. And if you've ever been at the mouth of a furnace in British steel, you'll appreciate why that is the case. An interesting little aside about Venus is that the carbon dioxide levels are considerably higher than they are on this planet. And you might wonder if this is a runaway example of global warming. That was just a little remark, not a statement of fact. So we have established that Venus, although it's the most likely planet in our solar system to have life, in fact it doesn't, and it is not at all possible. Now, one of the factors you've got to think about the Earth is its size, and the reason for that is, of course, we're familiar with the concept that the mantle or the crust which we're standing on is solid, but much of the substance of our planet is molten, and we see that when we have volcanic eruptions of molten lava that spew out. Now, it is molten principally because you could think of the center of the Earth as being like a giant nuclear reactor. And of course, the amount of energy it's producing keeps the center a liquid. Now, you've got a problem here, and the question is, what if the planet gets smaller? Well, if the planet gets smaller, so does the nuclear reactor. And of course, if you're familiar with the concept that the volume of an object is related to its surface area, in that the smaller the diameter, the bigger the surface area to the volume, and that means the bigger the loss of heat. And a small planet like Mars, which you see in this particular example, which is something like 2/5 or 3/5 of the size of this planet, has hit this problem where the core has cooled down so much that the surface temperatures are very low. And to give you an idea, that you're seeing the North Pole of the planet up here, and you would think that was ice, but in fact it's solid methane. Methane gas that's turned into solid, and carbon dioxide. Now, I am a bit bemused by the statement that Mars is undergoing global warming, in that North Pole, the ice cap, is retreating. So it would appear to be that global warming is not merely a thing that is caused by man, but there seem to be other factors involved in it as well. And nobody really knows exactly what the proportion is. So that's Mars. It's too small, it's too cold. Well below 0 degrees centigrade, and life cannot exist on it. You have the opposite problem if the planet is too big. That means that the core gets bigger, producing a lot more heat, and the surface temperature gets too high, and you've gone to the opposite extreme, where it's just too hot for life to exist on the planet. So it's rather interesting that the planet Earth is just the right size, where it's producing enough heat from its core to keep the temperature between the two critical parameters, which are 0 degrees centigrade and 100. And they are the critical parameters because that's when water exists in its liquid form. And life as we know it revolves around water. If the animal or plant is not in water, it's because water is in the animal or plant. Water is the essential feature of life as we know it. Now, next thing to move on to is to consider the moon, and how it is that the moon actually has any influence upon whether or not life exists on our own planet. Now, of course, this picture here, the moon is not as close to Earth as it is in the picture. It's just that you need a much bigger screen, or shall you say, a much wider screen if you were to get the two in the same picture. Now, I delight in teaching school kids occasionally, and I had to teach them about tides, and this is really what it's all about. And I just want to run down this line. So here we have the moon in the upper right. We have the Earth down here in the lower left, and we're looking down on top of the Earth, so we're actually looking, as it were, down onto the North Pole. And we're familiar with the concept that the Earth is rotating on its axis, and it does a complete rotation every 24 hours. And of course, that's why we have so many hours of daylight and so many hours of dark. But this has quite a consequence on the possibility of having tides. And the reason for this is that the moon is exerting a draw on the Earth in such a way that it pulls water towards it on the surface of the Earth that is nearest to it. Now, I can't explain this because I don't understand, and there's probably somebody in the audience that do, but the opposite is true. The same is true on the other side, that the water level deepens. So you can actually draw a line, as it were, from the moon through the Earth, and on that line, the water levels are higher. Now, if you imagine that there's a wee guy here, and of course he wouldn't be a very wee guy if he was that size relative to the planet, but you've got to use a bit of imagination, and he's probably needing to lose some weight. This is what you call rotund. But if he's sitting here, or standing here, you can see that the water level is very low, and this, of course, is low tide. And I'm just saying that it's midday. I'm being a bit simplistic in that I'm giving you the idea that you have 2 tides in 24 hours, which is not strictly accurate, but it's enough to illustrate the point. And of course, as the Earth rotates, he moves round about 6 o'clock in the evening to a bit of the Earth where the water levels are very high. And of course, this is high tide. And then, given another 6 hours, he's back to low tide again at midnight, and then he goes eventually back to where he started from. And so, roughly in 24 hours, you have 2 low tides and 2 high tides. Now, you might wonder why I'm making such a big deal of the tide. And I want to preempt a question, because it's a question which I anticipate people asking. And it's a question, doesn't the sun cause the tides? And the answer is, it contributes to the tides, but it's not the major factor. And I want to illustrate what this is about. So here we have the sun on the upper right. Again, we have the Earth. And the sun does exert a pull on the Earth. And if the moon is aligned with the sun, so if you draw a line, you can actually draw a line through the Earth, the moon, and the sun, you get a very, very high tide. And this, of course, is what we call a spring tide. And you get them once, well, I was going to say once a month, but once every 28 days. But when the moon is either waxing or waning, and is a half moon, so it's at right angles, what happens then is you can see that the tide facing the sun is less than the tide facing the moon. You see that? Right? And that's a very good illustration of the fact that it's the moon that is the principal draw of the tide and not the sun. But when you have this situation where the moon's at right angles to the sun, you have the neap tide. And this is where the high tide is not very high and the low tide is not very low. Whereas a spring tide, the high tide is very high and the low tide is very low. And we find it very interesting as kids when we were down in Gourock. I come from Gourock, because if you have a spring tide combined with a storm, we used to go down to the shore and see all the yachts wrecked on the beach. That was our entertainment as kids. The people who owned the yachts didn't appreciate our fascination by it. Now, why are the tides so important? Well, one thing you've got to remember is that the surface of the ocean, first of all, I should point out, of course, that the ocean forms by far the biggest surface area of the planet. It's much bigger than the landmass. And the surface of the ocean contains small, single-celled plants. And these plants, of course, are busy fixing oxygen and producing carbon dioxide. And they make a major contribution to the balance of oxygen and carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. And if they were wiped out for some reason, the balance would be completely lost, and you'd land up in a situation where there was much, much more carbon dioxide than what we have today. I mean, it would be global warming or run completely mad. Now, the other thing to remember is, of course, that people are thinking, well, what about the trees, the Amazon rainforest? And that's very, very true. But an aspect of it you've got to remember is that it's a relatively small land mass that can be inhabited by plants. So you go above something like, say, 10,000 feet, it gets so cold that there's very little doing on the plant kingdom. So the ocean is making a major contribution to the levels of oxygen and the removal of carbon dioxide. Now, the tide is important because the nutrients needed to supply these plants would lie at the bottom of the ocean. And you have to continually stir up the ocean and create currents in it to flush these nutrients to the surface, and by doing so, feeding the plants that are on the surface. And the tides are one of the major contributors to this flushing. There are, of course, ocean currents, etc., but tides have a very significant role. Now, moving on a little bit, I hesitate to talk about weather, particularly because I'm from the west coast of Scotland, and weather in the west coast is very predictable. We have a saying in Greenock that if it's not raining, it's because it just has been and it's just about to. Now, although I give Greenock a severe slagging, one thing you will probably be very well aware of is the whole business of the Gulf Stream passing up the west coast of Scotland, making a profound change on our weather, in that we never really have any bad winters and we never really have any incredibly hot summers. That's not the case on the East Coast, is it? Haha, that's another wee joke. Right. And the Gulf Stream is a major ocean current, and I don't want to go down the whole line of it, but it's an illustration that the movements of the ocean have an impact upon the weather and therefore upon life itself. Now, the question one would ask is, if you consider the possibility of the moon being larger than what it is, or a little bit closer to the Earth, what would the impact of that be upon our planet? And the answer would be that the tides would be higher than what we see today. Now, we're aware of the business of global warming, that if we have an increase of something like 20 metres of water, it would be catastrophic for much of the land surface, because a lot of the land which is arable, which we actually use, would be flooded. And this is exactly the scenario which we would have in a slightly larger moon, or being slightly closer. And of course, the larger and closer it came, the worse the catastrophe would be, until eventually there was virtually no landmass that would be inhabitable because of that. Likewise, if the moon was actually slightly further away, or smaller, the reverse would be the case, where the tides would become so small that it's questionable if there would be enough movement of water to bring the nutrients flush to the surface and to maintain the small plants living on the surface of the oceans. So the distance which the moon is from our planet and the size of the moon relative to us has a profound impact upon life on our planet. Moving away from the moon, I want to then consider how the Earth actually orbits around the sun. And before I actually talk about that in great detail, I think one thing I really have to point out is how critical it is where our planet is relative to the sun. Now there we have the sun in the centre, and we have the Earth buzzing around outside in an orbit. Ignore this bit here. This is just a little bit of background to enhance the picture. Now, if you do a very simplistic diagram where you've got the sun sitting in the centre, and of course the Earth is orbiting round the sun, and we consider the Earth in this position on the right-hand side. And what I want you to notice is that at this position, the North Pole is facing towards the sun, and the South Pole is facing away. Now, this would be our summer, where we're spending much of our day in daylight, whereas the South Pole are having their winter, where much of their day is actually being spent in darkness. And of course, we're aware that the further north or south you go, the more dramatic the impact is, that the temperatures drop and the daylight gets less. And of course, the opposite is true when we're on the other side. This is something like, 170 days later, where it would be our winter, where we're in the North Pole, we're mostly in darkness, whereas those in the South Pole are enjoying their summer. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is that you've got a very small change in the distance of the Earth, or should I say the distance of the pole from the sun, and yet we are very much aware of the impact that has on our weather. Now, you've got a much greater scenario than that, and it's this, that the Earth has an almost perfect circular orbit round the sun. Now, that is not normal. That is actually unusual. It's relatively unique. It's not completely unique, but it's relatively unique. That if you look at planets orbiting around suns in other galaxies, you'll find that most of them have an elliptical orbit. Now, that has a profound impact upon whether or not you have life. And the reason for that is that if you have an elliptical orbit, at this point here, you're significantly closer to the sun, and at this point here, you're significantly further away than if you were in a circular orbit. Now, they reckon that the tolerance levels is something like 2.5%. And what they mean by that is that if we're 2.5% nearer to the sun, the temperature goes beyond 100 degrees centigrade and you lose all the water. And that means that there's no life possible on the planet. So, at this point of the ellipse where you're close to the sun, you've boiled off all the water and you've eliminated life. At this point here, you're so far away from the sun that you're deeply frozen. And of course, if you go well below 0 degrees centigrade, there are some creatures that can survive fairly low temperatures, but the vast majority of life would not be able to survive in these conditions. So that the Earth has a circular orbit plays a major role on whether or not life can exist on our planet. Now, you may remember I said that the other planets have a deciding factor in whether or not life exists on our own. And the reason for this is that the other planets in our solar system also have a circular orbit. And the significance is that if they had an elliptical orbit, like you see in this bigger planet out here, you can see it's actually an elliptical orbit, it would pull the Earth into an elliptical orbit as well. And you understand the ramifications of that. That basically we would lose the possibility of life on our own planet. Another feature to think about the planets and the role that they have with us is the whole problem of comets and asteroids. That there is a continual stream of, if you take asteroids, I think they can be very simply described as very small planets, and they're bombarding our solar system with a regular monotony. And it's said that the planets in the inner part of the solar system protects the Earth from an awful lot of hits. Now, the Earth has been hit. And there are places you can go to in the world where you see enormous craters where comets or asteroids have hit. But the thing is, it is considerably rarer than what other planets. And this is a classic example where you look at the moon and it looks like somebody with a severe dose of acne. All the pot marks, you see that? And that's one of the craters seen at higher magnification. And it's an indication that the moon has saved us from an awful lot of bombardment by asteroids. Okay? Now you move on to comets, and I found comets rather interesting because I was very naive. Now I should say at this point one or two things. One of them is I am not an astronomer. Can't even say the word. Astronomer. I'm coming into this as somebody who knows very little about the subject. I'm a basic scientist in the biological field, and it's only through reading of the stuff that I'm become aware of some of these features. And I naively assumed that when you looked at a comet, the tail of the comet indicated the direction in which the comet was flying. You know, when you look into the sky and you see a jet leaving a vapor trail, well, you can see, you know the jet's moving forward because the vapor trail's behind it. But this is not the case in comets. If we do a wee diagram here, you would imagine that the comet is moving from the left of the screen to the right. But in fact, this particular comet is moving from the bottom to the top in a clockwise fashion. And the tail is actually caused by radiation streaming from the sun, which blasts away at the surface of the comet, forming this fiery light. Now, comets they don't tend to hit the inner part of our solar system like asteroids do, but they certainly do hit a lot in the outer part. And I think some of us are old enough to remember the comet Shoemaker-Levy, and it was in the newspapers the possibility that it could hit planet Earth, and if it did so, that would completely wipe out life on our planet. But what actually happened was it got taken in by, I think it was Uranus, can't remember which planet, one of the bigger planets. It got too near and it got sucked into the planet by its gravitational field. Now, the reason why I mention comets is that they reckon that comets have a very short life. They're measured in a matter of a few thousand years. And that's created havoc with the idea that the whole cosmos must be billions of years old, because how do you explain the existence of comets if they're only a few thousand years old? And they come out with this tentative theory, which at the moment has no proof, that there is what they call an Oort cloud. And this is the solar system we have here in the centre. And this Oort cloud is well outside our visual range, so we cannot see the Oort cloud, not even with the Hubble telescope. And this cloud is continually producing new comets and asteroids, and that's why you have comets and asteroids which are a few thousand years old. Now, at the moment, there's no substantial evidence that that actually is true, but that is the theory. I should also mention that the moon has upset calculations quite considerably, because they have noticed over the last 30 years, and it's now accepted, that there are volcanic eruptions in the moon. And the significance of that is that it means that the core is still hot, which means that because of its small size, it cannot be anywhere near as old as what they thought it was. It must be an awful lot younger. Probably, I don't know if they're talking about tens of thousands of years, but certainly not the sort of numbers which they have been using to describe the age of the cosmos. Now, to turn our attention to the sun. You used to read in textbooks that the sun was an ordinary sun. It was nothing remarkable. You won't read that in the textbooks anymore. It's actually one of the larger suns that exists in the cosmos, and its size is very, very important to whether or not you can actually have life in its solar system. Now, if you have this situation where the sun is smaller than what we have, in order to get the benefits of light from that sun, the planet has to be closer to the sun. But there comes a point where the planet gets so near to the sun that it becomes what they call tidally locked. And what I mean by that is, if you were to imagine, so we say that the sun was there and I was Earth. As I rotate around the sun, of course, I'm actually rotating all the time as I'm going around it. But when you're talking about a tidally locked planet, it faces the sun as it orbits the sun. It never changes its face. And of course, this is exactly what's happened with the moon relative to the Earth. We always see the same face of the moon. You never see any other face than the face which is seen every day, every night. Although, of course, in Scotland you can see it every day because there's so little sunlight that you see the moon anyway. By the way, I'm not a member of the Scottish Tourist Board. I don't actually sort of, not doing a very good selling job for our country. Now, the significance of being tidally locked is that the surface which is actually facing the planet, facing the sun, would be cooked. The temperatures would get very high. And the surface on the other side, of course, has the extreme opposite, where it gets very cold. And it's basically incompatible with life. Now, the other problem of small suns is the small suns are red dwarfs. And I think it's something like 70% or more of suns in the cosmos are categorized as red dwarfs. And the big problem of these red dwarfs is that they are very unstable. They do not produce the same amount of sunlight consistently. And what they actually produce, of course, is what we call solar flares. Now, our own sun also produces solar flares, but they have so little impact upon the average energy output that it changes only by something like 1%. So there's very, very little fluctuation in the sun's energy output. Whereas when you look at red dwarfs, it's much, much greater than that. Now, these are examples of solar flares in our own sun. Now, the problem with the red dwarf is that you are so close to that sun that when these solar flares come out, they produce masses of radiation that completely strip away the atmosphere. So, one good blast of a solar flare and you cease to have an atmosphere on your planet. And of course, that means no life. Now, of course, we do have this problem to a smaller measure on our planet. And I'm referring to the Northern Lights, or the Aurora Borealis, which you can see here. It's a very, very spectacular example that was taken from a Canadian airbase. And this is where the sun's irradiation as a solar flare has passed through the vacuum, if you like, and has hit the Earth and always gets pulled into the poles of the Earth. And I'm sure many of you have seen drawings of the Earth with its magnetic field, and that the magnetic field always pulls into the North Pole and into the South Pole, so that if you have any radiation energy, that energy gets pulled into the poles and not into the centre. But as it passes through the atmosphere, it does do damage. Just so happens that we're the right distance and the sun is of the right stability not to have any appreciable impact upon the quality of our atmosphere. Now, this is a photograph of an eclipse where the moon has completely eclipsed the sun. I find it utterly remarkable that the moon is exactly the right distance between the Earth and the sun as to form a perfect eclipse, where it literally fits exactly the size of the sun, and you're just seeing the solar flares of the sun popping around the edges. Now, you could call that coincidence, but I do find that rather a remarkable coincidence. And I would suggest that it's an example of Scripture where it says that the heavens declare the glory of God, or the handiwork of God. It's almost as though God is saying, I'm here. And this is an evidence of it. I'm showing you that it's not just an accident. Things are just beautifully balanced. Now, the reason why I show you this is to speak about the sun itself. As I said, it's very, very stable. There's only about 1% changes in its energy. And it goes through a solar cycle of something like 11 years, where, if you like, its radiation is about 100%, And over a period of 11 years, it eventually increases up to 101%, and then it will come back to 100%. And I have heard it said that the cycle determines when we have our heat waves in the summer. And I find that quite interesting because when you think about it, we have a heat wave about every 10 odd years. You know, it's, I suppose this is the Scottish Tourist Board getting rubbished again, that, you know, temperatures above 27 degrees centigrade only occur less than once a decade. I used to say to the foreign students, don't slag our weather, because we did have a beautiful day on June in 1976. Now, to turn the attention to the galaxy. And what we see here, I think you can probably see the spiral arms. Can you see that? Can you use a bit of imagination and how these arms sort of irradiate out from the centre? The Earth is located between spiral arms, and it's the safest place to be. It's not near the core. They reckon that every galaxy, the core consists of a black hole. And when something passes into the black hole, like a planet or a sun or whatever, it experiences such enormous amounts of gravitational pull that it breaks up and produces incredible amounts of energy, radiation. And any planet that happened to be anywhere near the centre would be irradiated by that, and obviously that would completely destroy life. If you go to the more extreme outer part of the galaxy, you find that the elements get lighter and lighter and lighter until eventually, near the edges, all you have are hydrogen and helium. And we cannot make life just simply out of two elements. We need all these heavier elements which we're so used to, like carbon, sulfur, oxygen, and so on and so forth. So you can't, certainly they reckon there cannot be life on the outer fringes of our galaxy. Now, the other thing very interesting is that as the galaxy is doing this rotation, the sun itself is also moving through the galaxy, and it's almost like a dance. If you look in the old days when they do dancing, it was all clockwork, and you always sort of remained in a particular position in the not on the dance floor, but relative to everybody else. And the sun is doing that in such a way that it always remains in the same position between two spiral arms. And the point of that is that our solar system never gets near the core, the centre of the galaxy, and therefore never gets exposed to huge amounts of radiation. Nor does it cut across a spiral arm, and that hazards a very similar problem, where again radiation levels get so high that you wouldn't be able to have life as we know it. Now, there's another thing here which I find rather interesting, is that if you keep your eyes fixed on that for a short while, and then I stop it, can you see that it's actually rotating in an anti-clockwise fashion? Now, the significance of that is absolutely nothing. It's just an optical illusion. I find that rather interesting. So that basically is what I have to say tonight. This actually arose from a completely different quarter, and I don't know if you have the pleasure of having children. I don't, but I still get children ask me questions that makes you think a lot. And the question that I was asked was, is it possible that there is life anywhere else in the, well, not just the galaxy, but in the cosmos? Now, of course, the answer is very simple. We don't know. But it did cause me to consider the Earth in more detail and look at the features of the Earth which are essential to life. And that's basically what I'd like to present to you this evening. And to start with, I'd like to read a couple of scriptures from the Psalms. Planet. Now, of course, the two elements which we're particularly interested in concerning life is oxygen and carbon dioxide. And we're familiar with the fact that we breathe in oxygen and we breathe out carbon dioxide, and that plants do the reverse, that they breathe in carbon dioxide and they breathe in oxygen. That's in the presence of sunlight. And there's a nice balance between the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom, where the oxygen and the carbon dioxide remain at a relatively stable level because there's a nice balance of interchange between the plants and the animals. Now, of course, we're very aware of the whole business of global warming and the concept that the levels of carbon dioxide is increasing in the atmosphere, mainly due to the activities of man. But I don't actually intend to go down that line at all. I want to try and stick to the subject at hand. Now, this is the planet Venus, and I show you this because Venus was called the sister planet of the Earth because it was of a similar size to our planet and it appeared to be of similar composition. So it was reckoned that within our solar system, if there was going to be any other planet which would have life such as we know it, Venus was the most ideal candidate. The problem with Venus was that it was covered by such a dense atmosphere that we really had no idea what was happening on the surface. And we've only fairly recently discovered that the surface is so hot that metal exists in its molten state. Now, it doesn't require an Einstein to work out that life cannot exist in such circumstances. And if you've ever been at the mouth of a furnace in British steel, you'll appreciate why that is the case. An interesting little aside about Venus is that the carbon dioxide levels are considerably higher than they are on this planet. Sam is in the Old Testament, isn't it? That's a wee joke, sorry. And it's chapter 8, verse 3. And it says, "When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you are mindful of him?" Just repeat that. "When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you think of him?" And chapter 19, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork." Now, in speaking about it, I'd like to speak about features actually that occur on the Earth which are essential to life. And then to speak about the moon, and you might be surprised that the moon has got any bearing on whether or not you can have life on this planet, but it does, and you'll see why. Also, exactly how the Earth orbits around the sun has a profound impact on whether or not life can exist on this planet. And you might be surprised to hear that the other planets in the solar system also play a very key role in having life on this planet. It's of no surprise, of course, that the sun itself is one of the key elements in this. But another aspect which might be surprising is the fact of the galaxy. Exactly where we are in the galaxy determines whether or not life is possible on this planet. So I intend to deal with it in that order. So starting off with, first of all, with the Earth. Now, you're very familiar, of course, that the surface of the Earth is covered by the atmosphere, and it's principally nitrogen gas. And I like this particular picture because it shows very, very nicely the atmosphere occurring along the bottom here. This is this very sort of haze, thin haze. It just shows you how thin the atmosphere is relative to the rest of the